I told him he was too old to run the company. Those were close to the exact words. Not the exact words, but close enough that I've never been able to talk myself into a gentler version of what I said. We were standing in the tool room at Colvin Precision, 6 in the evening, most of the floor already gone home except for the hum of the compressor and the smell of cutting oil that never fully left that part of the building no matter the hour. And I told my father that the business had outgrown what he could manage at 74, that it was time for me to take full operational control. That this wasn't a question so much as a plan I'd already made. He didn't argue. He set down the die he'd been examining under the bench light, wiped his hands on the same shop rag he'd used for 30 years, folded it once, and set it on the workbench with a kind of finality I read, at the time, as simple agreement. "All right, Michael," he said. "It's yours." Then he reached into his pocket, took out the master key ring, the one that opened every door in that building, including the one to the file room in the back that I never once, in 4 years afterward, thought to ask him about, and handed it to me. I remember the weight of it settling into my palm, heavier than I expected for a set of keys, and thinking how easy that had been, how clean, how little friction there'd been in a moment I'd spent most of the drive over rehearsing arguments for. I didn't understand, not then, that he'd handed me the keys to every door but one, and that the one he'd kept was the only one that mattered. My name is Michael Colvin. I'm 41. I run Colvin Precision Machining, a manufacturer that produces close-tolerance components for aerospace and industrial clients, out of a 60,000 square foot facility on the west side of the county that my father built from a single rented bay in 1988. I have a wife, Ruth, 2 kids in high school, and no siblings in the business, which meant that whatever decisions I made about my father's role, I made largely alone. Without another set of eyes in the family to check the ones I was too close to see clearly, and without anyone whose stake in the outcome was equal enough to mine to push back with real weight. I want to walk through exactly how this happened, in the order it happened, because I think stories like mine only make sense if you don't skip to the part that hurts. This isn't a confession dressed up as an apology, it's an account. I was there for every part of it, and I misjudged nearly all of it, and the only thing I can offer you that's worth your time is the precision of how wrong I was, told in the order I earned it. My father, Arthur Colvin, started the company with $14,000 of his own savings and a single manual lathe he bought at auction from a shop that had gone under. He'd apprenticed as a machinist for 11 years before that, starting at 17, first under a man named Corliss who ran a small job shop 2 counties over. And my father used to say, the only thing Corliss ever really taught him was that a part is either right or it isn't, and that there's no version of close enough that survives an aircraft in flight. What he built wasn't just a business, it was a reputation, the kind that took decades to earn in an industry where a single bad tolerance on a single part can end a relationship a company spent 20 years building. By the time I was old enough to understand what he did, Colvin Precision had grown into a supplier trusted by 3 major aerospace subcontractors. And the largest of those relationships, an account with a firm called Harrow Aerostructures, worth just over 40% of our annual revenue, had been personally managed by my father since 1994, back when Harrow was still a regional supplier itself, before either company had grown into what it later became. He had one habit that everyone who worked with him eventually noticed. He never let a client hear about a problem from anyone but him. If a part came off tolerance, if a delivery was going to be late, if a price was going to change, my father made the call himself, before anyone asked him to, and he made it in a voice that never once sounded like he was bracing for the reaction. "Bad news doesn't improve with age," he used to say, standing at his desk with the phone already in his hand before the problem had fully finished happening. I heard him say it so many times growing up, at dinner, in the truck on the way to school, standing in the doorway of his office while he dialed a number he already had memorized, that it stopped registering as wisdom and started registering as background noise, the way a familiar hum stops registering as sound. It would matter more than almost anything else in this story. There's one story about the Harrow relationship that I think about often now, one my father told only once, in passing, at a Thanksgiving dinner years before any of this began. In 1996, 2 years into the account, Harrow had a defect surface in a batch of brackets Colvin Precision had supplied, a tolerance issue that traced back not to our shop, but to a raw material problem from Harrow's own supplier upstream. It wasn't our fault. My father caught it anyway during a routine inspection before it ever reached Harrow's assembly line, absorbed the cost of the rework himself rather than bill for it, and drove 3 hours to deliver the corrected parts in person rather than wait on a freight schedule that would have put Harrow's own delivery at risk. He never told Harrow whose fault the defect actually was. He told me once, and only once, that the point wasn't who was right. The point was that a company you can trust with a mistake is worth more than a company that's merely accurate, and that Harrow had remembered that delivery for the better part of 30 years in a way no contract could have manufactured. I didn't think much of that story when he told it. I filed it, the way I filed most of his stories, under sentiment rather than strategy. By the time I came into the business full-time in my late 20s, after 4 years as a project engineer at a competitor across the state, I believed, genuinely believed, not performed, that my father's methods had calcified into habits the company could no longer afford. He kept the master production schedule in a paper binder he updated by hand, cross-referenced against a wall calendar with a red grease pencil, while I'd spent my 20s learning ERP systems that could do the same work in real time across 4 production lines, generating reports at the click of a button that used to take him an evening with a calculator. He negotiated pricing over the phone and in person, in conversations that were never fully documented anywhere but his own memory and a handful of index cards he kept in his desk drawer, while every modern shop I'd worked in ran contract terms through standardized templates that any account manager could execute without ever having met the client face-to-face. I used to sit in on his calls sometimes, early on, ostensibly to learn, and find myself mentally rewriting his pitch as I listened, cutting the small talk about a client's grandchildren or a fishing trip down to nothing, certain that a leaner, faster version of the same conversation would serve the business just as well, maybe better, without ever testing whether that was actually true. I told myself, and I told Ruth, my wife, more than once over dinner, lying awake more than once turning it over, that my father wasn't behind because he was old. I was careful about that distinction, even to myself, careful in the way a man is careful when he suspects the distinction might not hold up under real scrutiny. He was behind because the industry had changed shape around a man who'd built something durable enough that he'd never had to change with it. That was the story I told myself. It absolved me of most of what I was about to do, and it was almost entirely true, which is exactly what made it dangerous. The moment itself happened on a Thursday evening in late September, after a board meeting where I'd presented a 5-year growth plan built around an ERP overhaul, a new business development hire, and a private equity minority investment I'd already begun quietly courting to fund an expansion into a second production line. I'd spent 3 weeks building the deck, running the numbers past our controller twice, rehearsing the pitch in the shower some mornings before anyone else was awake. My father had sat through the presentation the way he sat through everything, attentive, unreadable, a legal pad in front of him with a few lines written in pencil, asking 2 questions the entire hour, both of them about cash flow timing rather than strategy, the kind of questions that told you he'd absorbed every number on the slide without needing to comment on the strategy behind them. After the room cleared, I stayed behind, telling myself I wanted to check in with him about the plan. Though if I'm honest, I already knew what I intended to say, and had simply been waiting for the right room to say it in. I found him in the tool room, going over a die set with one of the senior machinists, Ruben Ortiz, who'd worked under him for over 20 years, and whom my father trusted with judgment calls he trusted almost no one else with. I asked Ruben to give us a minute. He looked between the two of us for a second longer than was comfortable, the kind of look a man gives when he can tell something is about to happen that he'd rather not be present for, and then he set down the gauge he was holding and left. And I noted it even then, though I didn't dwell on it, that Ruben didn't look at me on his way out. He looked at my father, the way you look at someone before you leave a room you suspect they're about to need steadying in. I told my father, standing in that tool room with the smell of cutting oil still in the air and the compressor cycling somewhere behind the far wall, that I thought it was time for a change at the top. I used the word transition. I used the word runway, said something about wanting him to enjoy the next chapter of his life without the daily weight of running a 60-employee operation. And then, when he didn't say anything right away, I said the thing directly, because I've always believed that dressing up a hard truth just delays the discomfort rather than removing it, that he was 74, that the business had grown past the point where his methods could keep pace, that I thought it was time for him to hand over full operational control and step into an advisory role. I remember watching his face while I said it, looking for some flicker of resistance, some argument I was prepared to counter with the numbers I'd just spent an hour presenting to the board. There wasn't one. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, the way he listened to a machinist explain a defect before he ever assigned blame, his eyes on me the entire time, steady, unhurried. And when I finished, he was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it probably was, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd need to say it again, long enough that I found myself bracing for a response I had no real plan for beyond the numbers I'd already presented once that evening. "All right, Michael," he said. "It's yours." He wiped his hands on the shop rag, folded it, set it on the bench, and reached into his pocket for the master key ring, a heavy brass ring with keys to every door in the building, the loading dock, the tool crib, the server closet, the file room in the back that held decades of client correspondence nobody had digitized. He handed it to me without ceremony, the way he'd hand a part to an inspector for sign-off. No more weight in the gesture than that. "You'll want the combination to the safe too," he said. "I'll write it down for you." That was the entirety of it. No argument, no negotiation, no attempt to talk me out of it or slow it down. None of the resistance I'd spent the drive over half expecting and half hoping for, because some part of me, even then, wanted him to make the case for himself so I wouldn't have to be the one who took it from him. He didn't make that case. I drove home that night feeling the particular satisfaction of a difficult conversation handled cleanly. The kind of satisfaction I now understand was built entirely on the assumption that his silence meant surrender rather than something closer to patience. There was one other person in the building that evening who reacted differently. Ruth had asked me at dinner the night before, when I'd told her what I was planning to say, whether I was sure this was the right way to have the conversation, whether it wouldn't be better to sit down with my father properly, over a weekend, rather than catching him in the tool room at the end of a long day. I told her the tool room was fine, that my father didn't need ceremony, that ceremony was more for my own comfort than his, and in hindsight I think that answer told her something about my state of mind, that I couldn't yet see myself. Reuben had been standing near the loading dock door when I walked out to my truck, arms crossed, waiting for me in a way that told me he'd been standing there a while. He asked me, in a tone I dismissed at the time as simple concern for his own job security, whether my father was really stepping back from the Harrow account personally, or just from the day-to-day floor work. I told him the Harrow relationship would transition to our new business development hire over the following 2 quarters, that it was time the account ran on standardized terms like everything else, and that this wasn't something he needed to worry about. Reuben didn't argue with me either, but he didn't look relieved, and he stood there a moment longer than the question required, like he was deciding whether it was his place to say more. Before he said something as I was getting into my truck that I filed away and didn't think about again for over a year, "Your dad's been making that Harrow call himself for 30 years. There's a reason it's never been anybody else." I told him I appreciated his input and that I had it handled. I believed that completely, and I remember thinking, pulling out of the lot, that Reuben's loyalty to my father was admirable but slightly sentimental, the kind of thing a younger business would eventually have to grow past. The 18 months that followed were, by nearly every measure I was tracking, the best stretch the company had seen. We closed the private equity minority investment that spring, $6 million in exchange for a 22% stake, earmarked for the ERP overhaul and the new production line. The overhaul itself went smoothly enough that our controller sent around a company-wide email calling it the smoothest system migration this shop has ever seen, and I remember reading it at my desk. that this was the proof I'd been waiting for, evidence that the instincts I'd built my case around in that tool room had been correct. We hired a business development director, a sharp 34-year-old named Trent Aldis, who'd come from a much larger manufacturing group down south, and I handed him the Harrow account over 2 quarters, exactly as I'd told Reuben I would. Moving the relationship from my father's handwritten notes and personal phone calls onto a standardized account management platform with quarterly pricing reviews and templated correspondence that any of us could pull up and understand in under a minute. Revenue held steady through the transition, and Trent, to his credit, handled the account competently, polished, responsive. Exactly the kind of professionalized relationship I'd wanted to build. My father came into the shop 3 days a week in his advisory capacity, mostly working the floor with Reuben and 2 other longtime machinists on legacy tooling issues, the kind of work that had nothing to do with the parts of the business I'd taken over and everything to do with the parts he still clearly loved. Occasionally sitting in on a leadership meeting where he asked, as always, sparse and specific questions about cash flow rather than strategy. He never once brought up Harrow directly. He never asked how Trent's transition with the account was going, never asked to sit in on a call, never so much as mentioned the account's name at a family dinner, which struck me at the time as exactly the kind of graceful stepping back I'd hoped for, and, if I'm honest, hadn't fully expected. I took his silence, as I'd taken it 18 months earlier in the tool room, as confirmation that he'd made his peace with the new arrangement, that whatever pride might have been bruised in that first conversation had settled into something closer to relief at not having to carry the weight anymore. There were 3 things, small things, that I noted during that stretch and didn't think about again until much later. The first was in the spring after the handover, when my father mentioned, almost in passing while we were reviewing a tooling budget at his kitchen table, that he'd had lunch the previous week with a man named Douglas Pruitt, whom I understood vaguely to be a retired procurement executive who'd once worked at Harrow Aerostructures decades earlier, long before my time in the business. My father said it the way you'd mention running into an old colleague at the hardware store, the same flat, unremarkable tone he used for weather and hay yields. I asked how Douglas was doing. Same as always, my father said. We still talk shop now and then. I didn't ask what shop meant, because I assumed it meant nostalgia, 2 old men trading stories about a business neither of them ran anymore, and I moved on to the next line item on the budget, more interested in a discrepancy in tooling depreciation than in an old man's lunch plans. The second was that summer, when I noticed, going through some files ahead of a routine intellectual property audit our PE partners had requested as part of standard portfolio governance, a reference in an old correspondence folder to something called the 1988 cold forming process assignment that I couldn't immediately place in our current IP documentation. I mentioned it to our outside counsel at the time, a young associate handling the audit who was juggling a dozen other portfolio companies that quarter, and she told me it was probably an old internal memo and not to worry about it unless it surfaced again in the formal search. I didn't pursue it further. I had 4 other things on my desk that week that felt more urgent: a supplier contract renegotiation, a hiring decision for the second production line, a customer complaint from a smaller account that needed handling before it became a bigger one, and I filed the reference away as an administrative loose end from a much earlier era of the business, the kind of thing that accumulates in 35 years of paperwork and rarely means anything by the time anyone notices it. The third was smaller still, my father mentioned, one evening that fall, standing in his driveway while I dropped off some tooling drawings, that he'd spent part of the weekend going through some old patent paperwork in a box he kept in his study at home, sorting it because, he said, there's more of it than I remembered, and some of it should probably be somewhere safer than a cardboard box. I asked if he wanted me to have our counsel look at it. He said no. He was almost through sorting it himself, and that most of it wouldn't mean much to anyone but him anyway. And then he asked whether I thought the frost would hold off long enough to get the last cutting of hay in, which was his way of ending a conversation he didn't want to continue. None of these 3 things alarmed me. Each one, on its own, was the kind of unremarkable detail that fills the space of an ordinary year for a man in his 70s easing into retirement, an old friend, an old file, an old box. It was only much later that I understood they were not separate at all, and that each of them was my father quietly attending to the one part of this business I had never once thought to ask him about, because I had never considered that there might be a part of it I didn't already fully own. The turn came on a Wednesday in March, roughly 20 months after the toolroom conversation, during the second-round due diligence process for a larger growth equity round I was pursuing to fund the expansion I'd promised the board 2 years earlier. $12 million this time. Enough to build the second production line and finally break into a fourth aerospace vertical we'd been circling. For years, our PE partners had brought in a specialist IP attorney, a meticulous woman named Constance Ryland, to run a deeper patent and licensing search than the initial portfolio audit had covered. Standard procedure, she told me over the phone before the visit, whenever a growth round hinged in part on proprietary process technology, which ours did. Since Colvin Precision's entire competitive advantage in the aerospace segment rested on a cold-forming die process my father had developed in 1988, one that produced tolerances our competitors still couldn't match without licensing equivalent technology at significant cost, the same technology that had anchored every pitch deck I'd built for 4 straight years. Constance called me into a conference room on a Wednesday afternoon with a printed patent record in front of her and a laptop open to a database search result. And she didn't waste time on preamble. "I need to walk you through something," she said. And there was nothing dramatic in her tone, only the flat carefulness of someone who deals in facts rather than reactions. The same register, it occurred to me later, that my father used whenever he delivered bad news. The cold-forming process patent, the actual intellectual property underpinning close to half the company's revenue, was not assigned to Colvin Precision Machining. It had been filed in 1988 in the name of Arthur Colvin personally, and it had never been formally assigned to the corporate entity when the company incorporated the following year, an oversight, or a choice, that predated every piece of governance structure I'd built since taking over. The company had been operating for 35 years, on an informal, undocumented license from my father to use his own patent, a license that existed only in practice, never in a signed agreement, and that any growth equity investors' counsel would flag as an existential risk the moment they saw it, because if my father chose, at any point, to license that same process to a competitor, or simply declined to formalize the assignment, the entire foundation of the company's valuation could be called into question, and the $12 million round I'd spent 6 months building could unravel in an afternoon. I sat with that for a moment before I said anything, watching Constance turn the laptop slightly so I could see the filing record myself. My father's name, his old home address from 1988. A signature I recognized instantly, even reduced to a scanned facsimile. Then I asked her the obvious question: how had this never surfaced before? Not in the first PE round, not in any prior audit. She told me the initial audit 18 months earlier had flagged an unusual reference. She pulled up the exact language. The 1988 cold-forming process assignment memo I remembered dismissing as an old administrative loose end during a week I'd been too busy to care, but that without a follow-up search at the deeper level she was now running. It had been easy to assume the assignment existed and simply hadn't been refiled in modern records. It had taken this second, more rigorous search, triggered only because the size of this new round demanded it, to confirm that the assignment my father supposedly hadn't finalized in 1989 had in fact simply never been completed, and had remained exactly where he'd left it for 35 years, entirely within his own name, entirely within his own control, untouched by every ERP system, every governance overhaul, every piece of modernization I'd layered over the business since the day he handed me that key ring. I remember, oddly, thinking in that moment, not about the money, but about every time I'd sat across from my father at a leadership meeting and watched him ask about cash flow timing instead of strategy, and wondering, for the first time, whether those questions had never been the limited scope of an aging man's attention, but the precise, narrow angle of someone who already knew exactly where the real risk in the business lived and had simply never needed to ask about the rest. Constance asked, carefully, whether I wanted her to draft a demand letter. She used the phrase corrective assignment, the kind of clean legal language that made the situation sound smaller than it was, compelling my father to formalize the transfer immediately, given the deal timeline we were working against. I told her I needed a day before deciding anything. I remember sitting alone in my truck in the parking lot afterward for a long while, the engine off, running through 4 years of decisions in a different light than I'd ever run through them before. Every efficiency I'd prided myself on, every system I'd modernized, every meeting where I'd watched my father's silence and read it as agreement, now looked different. The way a part looks different once you learn it was never actually in spec to begin with, no matter how clean it appeared on the surface. I called my father that evening, standing in the parking lot outside Constance's office, because I couldn't wait until I got home. I asked him, as evenly as I could manage, whether he was aware the cold-forming patent had never been assigned to the company. There was a pause on the line, and then he said, without any surprise in his voice at all, "I'm aware." I asked why he'd never mentioned it, not once. Not when I took over operations, not when we closed the first PE round, not at any point in the 4 years since I'd told him he was too old to keep running things day to day. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that I could hear, faintly, the radio playing in his kitchen behind him, and then he said, "You never asked whose name was on it, Michael. I wasn't going to volunteer information you never thought to require. I asked, and I could hear something tighten in my own voice as I said it, whether Douglas Pruitt, the old friend, the old lunch, the old shop talk, had anything to do with any of this. My father said, simply, Douglas ran procurement at Harrow for 20 years. He still knows people there. I like to know what I'm not being told, same as you're finding out now what you weren't." He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way he used to correct a machinist's setup sheet, as a fact requiring no further commentary. That was the fact that reframed everything. I had spent 4 years believing I'd modernized a business my father could no longer keep pace with, when in fact the single most valuable asset in that business had never belonged to the company at all. It belonged to him, entirely, undisturbed by any of the governance I'd built around it, protected not by a lawyer's aggressive maneuvering, but by nothing more than an old man's decision to let a folder sit exactly where he'd left it until someone finally thought to ask the right question. I thought about the ERP overhaul, the templated correspondence, the standardized pricing reviews, all of it built on the assumption that I had accounted for everything of value in that building, and understood now that I had spent 4 years modernizing the parts of the business he was willing to let me modernize, while the one part that actually mattered had sat quietly in a filing cabinet with his name on it, exactly as it had since before I was old enough to drive. I told Ruth that night, sitting at our own kitchen table long after the kids had gone to bed, and she listened the way she always listens, without interrupting, and then asked me the one question I hadn't let myself ask directly, whether I thought my father had done this on purpose, kept the patent in his name deliberately, anticipating a day exactly like this one. I told her I didn't know, and that it didn't entirely matter, that whether it was foresight or simple inertia from 35 years earlier, the effect was the same, and the fact that troubled me most wasn't the oversight itself, but how completely I'd failed to consider that there might be one. Ruth didn't offer me any comfort I hadn't earned. She said only that she'd wondered, back in that first year after the handover, why my father never seemed bothered by any of it, and that she'd assumed, same as I had, that he was simply a man at peace with retirement. Maybe he just knew something we didn't, she said. It was the kind of sentence that sounds obvious after the fact, and impossible to have arrived at on your own beforehand. I drove out to see him that weekend, that same drive I'd made 100 times since childhood, the turn off the county road, the mailbox my father had welded himself out of scrap pipe 30 years earlier. He was in his workshop at home, the small one behind the house where he still tinkered with old tooling designs on weekends, radio playing low, the particular quiet of a man who has never needed noise to keep him company. He didn't stop working when I came in, though he set down what he was holding once I started talking, and pulled a second stool over without being asked, the way he used to when I was a boy, and wanted to watch him work rather than talk to him. I told him the first thing plainly, because I believed by then it deserved to be said plainly that I had misjudged him, not because I thought he was foolish, but because I had mistaken his quiet acceptance in that tool room 4 years earlier for a genuine surrender of everything he understood about the business, when in fact he had surrendered only the parts I'd asked for, in the exact order I'd asked for them, and had held back, without a trace of resentment I could detect, the one thing I'd never had the humility to ask about. I told him I'd spent 4 years believing I was the one carrying the risk in this company, when in fact he'd been carrying a piece of it the entire time, quietly, without complaint, without once making me feel the weight of it. He listened to all of it without interrupting, the way he'd always listened to a machinist explain a mistake before assigning blame, his hands still, his eyes on me the whole time. When I finished, he set down the die he'd been holding and said, "I gave you the company, Michael. I never gave away what made it worth having." It wasn't delivered as an accusation. It was delivered the way he used to deliver a diagnosis on a bad part. Plain, complete, without any interest in making me feel worse than the facts already did. I sat with that for a while, listening to the radio hum low behind us, and then I asked him the harder question, the one that required me to understand something about him rather than about myself. Why, after everything, after I'd told him to his face in that tool room that his methods were outdated and his judgment no longer suited to running the company he'd built. He hadn't used the leverage he'd quietly held for 4 years to make me answer for it, why he hadn't let Constance's discovery become the moment he finally corrected me in front of the board, the investors, everyone who'd believed I'd built something entirely on my own, the moment he finally got to be right in front of an audience. He looked at me for a long moment, the same unhurried look he'd given me the day I handed him the growth plan, the look of a man who had already decided, long before I asked, exactly how much of this he intended to say out loud. "I wasn't protecting the patent, Michael," he said. "I was giving you time to find out you needed protecting too, before it cost you something you couldn't get back." That was the whole of it. He didn't explain further, and I didn't ask him to. Some sentences carry more by what they leave out than what they include, and I understood, sitting there in that workshop, that this was as close as my father was ever going to come to telling me he'd been watching out for me the entire time, even while I was busy believing I no longer needed him to. The weeks that followed, I did the concrete work rather than the emotional kind, because I'd come to understand finally that with my father, actions had always mattered more than sentiment, and that this was a trait I'd inherited from him without ever crediting the source. I had Constance draft a formal assignment agreement, negotiated properly this time, not extracted through oversight or inertia, but agreed to on terms my father reviewed line by line, at his own kitchen table, taking 3 separate meetings before he was satisfied every clause said exactly what it meant. A real licensing structure with real compensation attached to it. A royalty stream on the cold forming process that would run to him personally for the rest of his life, rather than the silent, undocumented arrangement that had let the company use his invention for free for 35 years. I brought him back onto the Harrow account directly, not as an advisor sitting quietly in meetings, but as the named relationship lead on renewals, with Trent supporting him rather than the other way around. Because I'd finally understood what Ruben had tried to tell me in a parking lot years earlier, that some relationships aren't a function that can be standardized onto a platform. They're a person, and we still had that person. Trent, to his credit, took the change well, and told me privately that he'd learned more sitting in on my father's first renewal call with Harrow than he had in 2 years of running the account solo, watching him navigate 30 years of history in a conversation that lasted 11 minutes and never once mentioned price. I also went back to Ruben, who'd tried to warn me in that parking lot years earlier, and told him plainly that he'd been right and I'd been wrong, that some things in a business aren't functions to be optimized, they're relationships built by a specific person over a specific span of years, and no software migration was ever going to replace that. Ruben didn't gloat about it. He just nodded, the way my father would have, and said he was glad the old man was back on the Harrow calls, because he'd never much liked watching Trent's polished emails go out under a name that wasn't the one Harrow actually trusted. At the next full company meeting, in front of the floor, in front of Trent, in front of the board, I said plainly that the cold forming process that had built this company's entire reputation in the aerospace segment belonged to my father, that it always had, and that the company was formally and gratefully compensating him for the use of it going forward, on terms he had negotiated himself. My father didn't make a show of any of it. He nodded once, the way he'd nod at the end of a satisfactory inspection, shook Reuben's hand afterward the way he'd shaken it after 1,000 smaller victories over 30 years, and went back to the tool room to finish the die he'd left half-machined that morning. His acceptance of the correction was exactly as measured as everything else about him. No speech, no visible relief, nothing that would have told a stranger in the room that anything of consequence had just been repaired between us, though Reuben caught my eye across the floor for a second afterward and gave me the smallest nod, the kind that told me he'd noticed exactly what had changed, even if no one else in the room had. I understood by then that this was the highest form of approval he was ever going to give me, and that it was enough, because I'd finally learned to read what his silence actually meant, instead of assuming it meant whatever was most convenient for me to believe. I don't know how to close a story like this with anything grander than what actually happened, which is that I spent 4 years believing my father's silence was surrender, when it was patience, and that the difference between those two things is the entire distance between a man who takes advantage of someone and a man who simply hasn't yet earned the right to be trusted with the full picture. It's a strange thing, running a business built on tolerances, on the idea that a part is either within spec or it isn't, and to have missed for 4 years that the same standard applied to how well I actually understood my own father, a man I'd known my entire life and still managed to underestimate in the one category that mattered most. There's a particular kind of pride that mistakes someone's restraint for the outer edge of what they have left, and I carried that pride long enough that it nearly cost me the one asset that made everything else I'd built worth having. I think about the key ring sometimes, the weight of it in my hand that evening in the tool room, how certain I was that he'd handed me everything. He had handed me almost everything. The part he kept back wasn't kept out of spite or doubt in me. It was kept the way a careful man keeps anything that matters, quietly, without announcement, until the day someone finally proves they're ready to be told. My father never raised his voice through any part of it. He didn't need to. He'd built the thing that mattered 35 years before I ever thought to ask whose name was actually on it. And he was willing to wait exactly as long as it took me to ask. If this one sat with you the way it sat with me, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more measured, honest stories.